Leo's phone was the first thing he touched each morning. The ritual was simple. He would open the social media app and watch the numbers load. A like on last night's post about his new project felt like a sip of water in a desert. A comment was a full meal. But this morning, after the launch he'd worked on for months, the screen was quiet. The silence was a physical weight. It settled on his chest, a tightness that made each breath shallow. His shoulders felt heavy, as if he were carrying the disappointment of the entire invisible audience. Online, his profile was a curated gallery of success. In the quiet of his apartment, he just felt empty. Then he saw it. A single comment. Overhyped. Expected more. The words were small on the screen, but they landed like a punch. The air left his lungs. The carefully constructed calm of the morning shattered. This was the inciting incident, the tiny crack that threatened to unravel him completely. The false refuge. Chasing external solutions. The feeling was intolerable. The emptiness needed to be filled, the silence drowned out. Leo's response was a reflex honed over years, more achievement. If that project didn't get the recognition, the next one would be bigger, louder, more perfect. He dove into a frenzy of hustle. He outlined new ideas, sent emails, made plans that stretched late into the night. For a few hours, the activity was a shield. The temporary validation of a great idea reply would warm him. But by evening, the silence would return, deeper and heavier than before. The cycle was a trap. Hustle led to a flicker of validation, which highlighted the underlying emptiness, which demanded more hustle. He was running on a treadmill, getting nowhere, just increasingly tired. It was during this frantic phase that he first noticed Maya. His apartment looked down onto a small, neglected community garden. While he was chasing the phantom of online approval, she was there every day. She didn't seem to be in a hurry. She just moved between the garden beds, watering, weeding, her movements slow and deliberate. There was a quietness to her that was the opposite of his internal storm. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't looking around for an audience. She was just with the plants. Her peace was a quiet accusation to his chaos. One afternoon, driven by a desperation he couldn't name, Leo went down to the garden. The air smelled of damp earth and growing things. He found her kneeling by a patch of tomatoes. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. Maya looked up, her face calm. She wiped a hand on her overalls. "I see you out here all the time," Leo continued, feeling awkward. "It looks peaceful. What's the secret? Are you a professional gardener?" Maya smiled a small, gentle smile. "No," she said. Her voice was steady. "I just show up for the plants." Leo waited for more. A philosophy, a technique, a secret mantra. But that was it. She turned back to the tomatoes, her attention already returning to the soil. He stood there for a moment, confused. Just show up? That couldn't be the answer. The answer was supposed to be complicated, a system, a hack. Not something so simple it felt almost foolish. Frustrated but with nowhere else to turn, Leo decided to try it. His motivation was all wrong. He wasn't going to the garden to find peace, he was going to acquire it, like another achievement to add to his list. He signed up as a volunteer, expecting a transformative experience to begin immediately. Instead, he was given a trowel and assigned to a weedy corner far from the thriving beds Maya tended. The work was mundane. It was repetitive. It was utterly uncelebrated. There were no likes for pulling a weed perfectly. No comments for turning over a patch of soil. His back ached. His mind raced, composing emails, rehearsing conversations, analyzing his failures. He was physically in the garden, but mentally, he was still trapped in the noisy room of his own anxieties. After a week, he was ready to quit. It felt like a waste of time. But on a quiet Thursday, something shifted. He was alone, tasked with carefully transplanting some struggling seedlings that had been crowded in a starter tray. The task required a gentle touch. He had to cradle the tiny root ball, make a small hole in the soft earth, and settle the plant in without crushing it. As he worked, his focus narrowed. The texture of the soil was cool and crumbly against his fingers. The rhythm of the task, dig, place, pat, was slow and steady. For the first time in weeks, the frantic noise in his head began to quiet. It didn't vanish, but it faded into the background, like a radio turned down low. He wasn't thinking about the outcome of the seedlings, whether they would thrive or die. He was just fully immersed in the simple, physical act of tending to them. He didn't hear Maya approach. He was so absorbed that her voice, when it came, was soft and didn't startle him. "You're not waiting for applause today." Leo looked up. He realized she was right. The familiar tension in his shoulders, the anticipation of judgment, was gone. He had simply been doing the work. It was a small thing. A flicker of quiet focus in a life defined by noise. But it felt like a crack of light under a heavy door. It was the first small step, taken for all the wrong reasons, that somehow led him to the beginning of a different path. Leo started returning to the garden every day. It was no longer a strategy to find a secret, it became a practice. At first, his mind still wandered back to the world of metrics and opinions. But the garden was a patient teacher. He began to notice things. He learned the difference between a plant that needed water and one that was simply resting. He felt the satisfaction of spotting a new bud, a small victory that required no external confirmation. Maya was often there, but she rarely gave instruction. She simply worked alongside him, her presence a quiet model of attention. "Some plants thrive," she said one day, gesturing to a row of lush greens. "Some struggle. We tend to them all the same." The metaphor sank in. His value in the garden wasn't tied to the success of every seedling, but to the consistency of his care. He started applying this mindset to his creative work back at his desk. He began a small project, something just for himself, with no intention of ever showing anyone. The old urge to check for feedback would arise, a tightness in his chest. But now, he had a new response. He would close his eyes for a moment. He would remember the feeling of the cool soil, the steady rhythm of his breath as he worked. He would give his attention a job, just like tending a plant. The work became the point. The joy was in the process itself, the flow of an idea, the shaping of a sentence. When external opinions did eventually come, whether praise or criticism, they landed differently. They were like weather passing over the garden. They didn't change the fundamental value of the soil, of the work itself. A steadiness was growing inside him, small and quiet, but real. The test came a few months later. He released a new piece of work into the world. It was something he cared about deeply. The old pattern waited, a ghost in the machinery of his mind. The moment of truth arrived. He opened the app. The response was mixed. There was praise, but there was also sharp, public criticism. The familiar sensation began. The tightness in his chest, the heat rising in his face. The heavy weight started to descend onto his shoulders, the old familiar burden. But this time, something was different. The feeling arose, but it didn't take over. It was like a wave that reached the shore and found a seawall. He didn't spiral into the noise. Instead, he put his phone down. He walked to the window and looked down at the garden. He didn't fight the feeling of tightness. He just breathed into it. He remembered the feeling of the soil, the simple act of showing up without needing anything in return. He thought of the struggling seedlings he had tended, how their worth wasn't conditional on their success. And in that quiet moment, the realization washed over him, not as a dramatic shout, but as a simple, quiet truth. His worth was not attached to this outcome. It had been there all along, like the sun behind the clouds, constant and unchanging. It was in his capacity to care, to show up, to try. The weight on his shoulders didn't vanish with a bang. It simply loosened its grip. It felt like a heavy coat, worn for years, being gently lifted away. The lightness was startling. It wasn't the euphoria of a victory. It was a quiet, sustainable peace. The storm of external opinion could rage, but he was no longer a small boat in its path. He was the gardener, standing on steady ground. Leo walked away from the window. He didn't reach for his phone to craft a response or seek comforting validation. He simply went to make a cup of tea. The need to be seen, to be approved of, had been a weight he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Now, he felt light. He was no longer walking toward an audience, but simply living his life. If you've ever felt that heavy weight, that ache for external approval, I encourage you to find your version of the garden. Find one small thing you can do, just for the sake of doing it, and show up. Your worth is already there, waiting to be felt.